On New Year's Eve, Clara, a tired waitress with aching feet and a gentle spine, slid a full plate to an old man in worn-out clothes, never knowing he was the billionaire owner in disguise. She did it quietly, the way people do when they're used to kindness being punished. She didn't ask his story, didn't demand proof of suffering, didn't turn his hunger into a spectacle. She only met his eyes for a second and treated him like a human being. And that small choice, made in the final minute of the year, would ripple through the bar like a crack racing across glass. The upscale place buzzed with low chatter and clinking glasses, dressed up in twinkling lights that tried too hard to look warm. Outside, winter pressed its cold face to the windows, while inside the air smelled of fried food, champagne, and something sharper, fear. Gold confetti lay scattered along the counter like tiny coins nobody could spend. Clara told herself it would be just another late-night shift, another round of forced smiles and hurried refills. Then a harsh voice cut through the music, and the whole room tilted toward humiliation. The manager, Lyle, leaned over the bar with a grin, meant for customers, and eyes meant for control, pointing at the stranger as if he were a stain. "Pay first," he said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, making it sound like a rule instead of a threat. A couple of people smirked, and others stared for a beat before looking away, relieved it wasn't happening to them. The digital clock above the bottles glowed 23:59, bright and unforgiving, as if even time wanted to watch. The stranger's shoulders stayed rounded, his cap pulled low, and he nodded with a stillness that didn't match the tremble in his hands. He asked for the cheapest item on the menu, his voice soft, like he'd learned the world listened better when he took up less space. Clara watched him stare at the counter as if it might swallow him whole, and something in her chest tightened. She had seen that posture before. People who had been turned away so often they started turning away from themselves. Without making a show of it, she poured him water first, setting it down like a blanket offered to someone shivering. Then, with a steady hand that surprised even her, she placed a plate in front of him with more food than he'd ordered, warm and real. When Lyle's gaze snapped toward her, Clara didn't flinch. She simply turned the receipt in her palm and lowered her voice as if kindness was just part of the job. The stranger finally lifted his eyes, and in that instant his expression froze, not with gratitude alone, but with a kind of stunned recognition, as if he'd forgotten what dignity felt like. Clara's name tag caught the light for a second, bright against her red uniform, before she stepped back to keep working like nothing happened. But Lyle's smile tightened, the corners sharpening into something mean, and behind that mean little smile, a desperate thought flickered, one last move he could make before the year changed. The manager's words didn't just land on the stranger, they landed on the whole room, and everyone felt it, even if they pretended not to. For a breath, the bar's laughter faltered, as if the music itself had been embarrassed into a softer volume. Clara kept moving because stillness was how people became targets here. She wiped the counter that was already clean, her fingers sliding through confetti like it was grit. The clock above the shelves kept glowing, steady and bright, like it was counting more than seconds. The stranger remained on his stool, with his shoulders drawn inward, as if the air around him had turned sharp. His hands rested near the edge of the bar, not quite claiming space, not quite letting go of it either. He stared at the water glass Clara had placed in front of him, watching the condensation gather and slip downward in slow trails. There was hunger in him, yes, but deeper than that was a practiced patience, the kind that comes from being dismissed too many times. Clara noticed his eyes weren't empty. They were alert, quietly taking inventory of everything and everyone. Around them, the celebration continued like a play performed by people who wanted to forget their own lines. A couple at the far end lifted their champagne flutes and laughed a little too loudly, as if volume could erase discomfort. The bartender avoided Clara's eyes, and the busboy moved faster than necessary, shoulders tight, face blank. The holiday lights blinked above the booths, warm in color but strangely cold in feeling. Even the glittering decorations seemed to hang heavier, like ornaments on a tree that had seen too many winters. Lyle paced behind the counter with a smile that never reached his eyes, enjoying the way attention bent in his direction. He tapped his ring against the wood in a neat little rhythm, a sound that carried farther than it should have. When he glanced at Clara, it wasn't a look of leadership, it was a warning dressed in politeness. Clara swallowed the heat rising in her throat and kept her expression neutral because she knew what happened to people who made problems. Still, something inside her refused to shrink all the way, and that refusal made her hands steadier than she expected. The stranger finally lifted the fork, then paused as if he had forgotten how to accept anything without paying for it in shame. He took one careful bite, slow and deliberate, like he was proving to himself he was allowed to exist in this moment. His gaze drifted across the room again, over the customers who looked away, over the staff who flinched, over the manager who fed on control. For an instant, his eyes returned to Clara, and the gratitude there was quiet but profound, the kind that hurts because it shouldn't be rare. And somewhere behind Lyle's polished grin, a small new fear began to bloom, because the wrong kind of stranger had started noticing the cracks. Clara didn't know it, but the man she'd fed wasn't just hungry, he was haunted. He sat there like someone wearing a costume stitched from failure, yet there was a careful steadiness in the way he listened to the room. His torn sleeve wasn't an accident, and neither was the silence he carried. He had come to this bar disguised as a nobody, not to play a game, but to see what his money had been protecting in the dark. And as the last minutes of the year slipped away, he felt the first sharp pull of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: responsibility. Years earlier, he had stood in a smaller version of this place, when the floors were still scuffed and the stools didn't match. His name was Everett Hale, and back then he knew every employee's face, every regular's story, every corner that needed fixing. He had built the business with a stubborn kind of hope, the kind that believed success didn't have to turn people cruel. He used to say the bar would be a second home for working folks, a place where no one got humiliated for counting their dollars twice. And for a while, it was true. His mother had planted that promise in him long before he had money. She worked until her hands looked older than her face, and she still found ways to be gentle with strangers. Everett remembered her slipping extra food onto a neighbor's porch without announcing it, like kindness was something you did quietly so pride could survive. She taught him that dignity was not a reward for the deserving. It was a baseline, like air. "If you ever get ahead," she used to tell him, "don't step on people to prove you're standing." He carried those words like a compass for years, until the world got louder. Then the success came fast, and the business multiplied, and his time thinned out into meetings and contracts and endless numbers. The bar became an asset on paper instead of a room he walked through with his own eyes. He started trusting reports more than people, trusting managers more than the staff who kept the place alive. Complaints filtered upward, softened by the time they reached him, turned into neat little summaries that never mentioned fear. Everett told himself that distance was necessary, that leadership meant letting others handle the details. But tonight, sitting under those bright lights with a cheap cap pulled low, Everett could see the truth hidden inside the details. The way the staff flinched wasn't normal. The way the manager smiled wasn't confidence. It was ownership, the wrong kind. And as Everett's gaze drifted to Lyle's ring tapping the wood, a memory surfaced with sudden clarity. A handshake in an office years ago, a recommendation he hadn't questioned, a file he'd signed without reading closely enough. His stomach tightened, Because the name Lyle wasn't just a manager's name, it was connected to a decision Everett had made when he was too busy to be careful. And for the first time that night, Everett realized the rot he was hunting might have started with him. Everett stayed in the role he had chosen, letting the weight of the disguise settle deeper on his shoulders. The torn sleeve, the lowered eyes, the quiet voice. Each detail was a shield and a mirror at the same time. He wasn't here to be comforted, and he wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to watch what happened when a person looked poor, tired, and inconvenient. And the longer he sat under the bar's warm lights, the clearer it became that cruelty had learned to wear a uniform. Lyle moved like a man who believed the room belonged to him more than it belonged to anyone else. He drifted between tables with an easy grin, collecting compliments from customers and compliance from staff. Up close, his smile looked polished, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning for weakness, the way some people scan for spilled drinks. He paused near Everett again, making sure the humiliation lingered, making sure everyone understood the rules were different for certain kinds of people. The ring on his finger tapped the counter twice, like punctuation at the end of a threat. Clara tried to keep the peace the way she always did. Soft voice, quick hands, steady posture. She offered a small special in a tone that made it sound normal, like the bar was still the kind of place where food was food and not a test. But Lyle cut across her with a laugh that carried too far, turning her quiet mercy into a public mistake. He didn't call her stupid outright. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her said it for him, and the staff nearby tightened as if they'd been hit second-hand. Everett watched every detail with a calm he had practiced in boardrooms and negotiations, but this felt different. In business, power was often loud. Here it was intimate, whispered, casual, daily. Lyle didn't just want control over money. He wanted control over breathing, over posture, over the way a person's shoulders rose when they were afraid. Everett noticed how receipts disappeared quickly, how the tip jar was placed where only certain hands could reach it, how schedules were talked about like favors instead of fairness. The bar's decorations glittered above it all, bright enough to fool strangers, not bright enough to hide the rot. As the countdown in the background climbed toward midnight, Lyle leaned closer to Clara and murmured something that made her face go still. She nodded once, swallowing her words like they were dangerous. Everett felt something hot rise behind his ribs. Anger, yes, but also shame that his name, his money, his distance had made this possible. He kept his gaze lowered, staying small, letting Lyle believe he was safe. And in that lowered gaze, Everett saw what he had come to find. The confidence of a man who thought no one above him was watching, because no one ever had. Clara felt Lyle's warning hang in the air long after he walked away, as if the words had claws. Still, she didn't take the plate back, and she didn't let her hands shake where anyone could see. She had learned that survival wasn't always loud. It was often a series of quiet choices made under pressure. The stranger's eyes stayed down, but Clara could sense his attention, the way he listened like someone collecting pieces. And somewhere inside her, a stubborn kindness rose, not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing she refused to let the job steal. She reached for the receipt and turned it slightly in her palm, shielding it from the angles that invited trouble. With a practiced motion, she adjusted the total, small, careful, almost invisible, then slid it closer to him, like it was nothing at all. The plate in front of him held more than the cheapest item he'd asked for, and the extra food looked like a secret wrapped in warmth. Clara didn't announce it, didn't make a speech, didn't try to be anyone's hero. Her eyes simply said, "You don't have to beg to be treated decently." That was all, and somehow it was everything. Everett's breath caught so sharply he had to pretend he was coughing. For years, people had smiled at him because they wanted something, because they feared him, because they needed his approval. Even kindness around him had often been staged, polished, performative, safe, but this was different, and it hit him like cold water. Clara's kindness carried risk, and she offered it anyway, as naturally as setting down a glass. He stared at the receipt and felt something in his chest go painfully quiet. He tried to push the plate back, lifting his hands in a small refusal. But Clara shook her head once, firm and gentle. Her smile wasn't bright. It was tired, the kind of smile that came from holding yourself together in places that tried to pull you apart. "Just eat," she murmured, as if she were speaking to someone she'd known a long time. Everett nodded because words felt too clumsy for the weight of what he'd just been given. He picked up his fork with care, like he was touching something sacred he hadn't earned. Then he felt it, the shift in the room, the tightening of air behind him. Lyle's gaze had found them again, sharp and suspicious, like a blade pulled from a sleeve. Everett didn't look up right away. He let the manager believe the disguise was working, let him believe this was just another poor man being managed. But Everett's heart was no longer calm in the same way, because Clara's simple gesture had done what money couldn't. It reminded him what dignity felt like, and in the corner of his vision he saw Lyle start walking toward them with a smile that didn't mean well. Lyle stopped beside Clara with the smooth timing of someone who enjoyed catching people in the act of being human. He didn't raise his voice this time. He didn't need an audience to be cruel. He leaned in as if he were sharing a joke, and his words slid out low and tight, meant for her ears only. Clara kept her face calm, but Everett saw the muscle in her jaw tense, the way her fingers briefly curled around the edge of the counter. In that tiny movement, he recognized the truth. She was used to swallowing fear like it was part of the uniform. "You like playing charity," Lyle murmured, smiling as if kindness were a personal insult. "Be careful. Charity comes out of your hours." His ring tapped the wood once, a small sound with a big shadow. Clara nodded, not because she agreed, but because she knew arguing would turn private punishment into public humiliation. There were bills waiting at home that didn't care about pride, and a sick parent who needed medicine more than she needed victory. So she kept her voice soft, her posture steady, and she let the moment pass through her like cold water. Everett stared down at his plate, but inside him something rose, sharp, hot, and old. Pride had always been his fuel, the thing that kept him building and winning and proving he could climb higher than where he came from. Yet pride had also been the thing that made him step back, delegate trust paperwork more than people, and call it leadership. Now that same pride demanded he stand up, reveal his name, end this in one sentence. His mouth almost opened, and for a second he tasted the relief of power, but he forced himself to close his lips again because he hadn't come for relief. He had come for the root, for the pattern, for the proof that would hold even when excuses were thrown like confetti. He watched the way Lyle's eyes flicked toward the register, toward the tip jar, toward the back office door, like a man guarding something that wasn't his. He watched how the staff avoided looking at him, how their bodies moved around Lyle's moods like a storm they'd learned to predict, and he realized that if he exposed himself too soon, Lyle would become a victim in his own story, and the system would stay intact. Clara stepped away to take another table, her shoulders squared in a way that looked like confidence from far away and looked like endurance up close. Everett noticed her red uniform was clean but worn at the seams, as if the job had been pulling at her for years. He noticed how she smiled at customers who didn't deserve it, because tips meant groceries and groceries meant survival. And he noticed something else too. Even under pressure, she didn't become mean. She was tired, but she was not cruel, and that made her rare. As the countdown drew nearer, the room grew louder, but the tension under it grew louder still. Lyle moved with more urgency now, checking corners, peering toward the back, as if worried about what the new year might bring. Everett's phone sat heavy in his pocket, a silent promise he hadn't yet fulfilled. He took one more bite, then set the fork down carefully, as if deciding something that couldn't be undone. Because pride had brought him here in disguise, but something deeper was starting to take its place, and it was beginning to feel like he was hunting more than theft. He was hunting the part of himself that had looked away. The bar swelled with that familiar pre-midnight energy, the kind that made strangers hug and made lonely people pretend they weren't lonely. Someone started chanting the countdown early, and a few voices joined in with laughter that sounded too bright. Clara kept weaving between tables, collecting empty glasses and forced smiles, trying to stay invisible in the way survival demanded. But Lyle had stopped seeing her as invisible. Tonight, he had decided she would be useful as an example. He waited until the room was full enough, loud enough, drunk enough on celebration to turn cruelty into entertainment. Then he stepped behind the bar and called her name with a sharpness that made the hairs on her arms rise. "Clara," he said, drawing it out like a warning, and the chatter around them thinned. She froze for half a beat, then walked back with her chin lifted as if she could hold herself steady by sheer will. Everett watched her approach, and something in his chest tightened because he recognized the moment a person is forced to perform their own humiliation. Lyle lifted the receipt with 2 fingers like it was contaminated. He spoke loudly now, turning a private threat into a public lesson. "We don't steal here," he announced, his grin flashing as if he were doing the room a favor. "We don't hand out food, we don't make up prices, and we definitely don't play little hero stories to impress anyone." A few customers laughed uncertainly, relieved the spotlight wasn't on them, and others looked down at their drinks like the bubbles might offer an excuse. Clara's face went pale, but her voice stayed controlled, quiet enough that only the closest tables could hear the tremor she refused to let grow. "I didn't steal," she said, and the words sounded simple, honest, almost childlike against Lyle's practiced performance. He stepped closer, invading her space, and Everett saw the way Clara's hands tightened at her sides, fighting the instinct to defend herself with anger. She knew anger would only feed him, would only make the story easier for him to twist, so she stood there, taking the hit, trying to keep her dignity intact while the room watched. Then Lyle delivered the blow he'd been saving. "You're done," he said, loud and clear, like a gavel. "Clean out your apron. Leave before midnight. I'm not starting the new year with thieves on my floor." The word thieves hung in the air like smoke. Clara's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry, not yet, because she refused to give him the satisfaction. She reached into her apron slowly, turning it inside out to show what she had. A pen, a small notepad, and a few crumpled bills that looked like desperation. Everett felt the room tilt, not from the noise, but from the weight of what he was witnessing. This wasn't discipline, this wasn't management. It was control sharpened into cruelty, and it had been happening long enough that people had learned to laugh along just to survive it. As Clara turned to leave, confetti clung to the red fabric of her sleeve like a cruel decoration, bright flecks mocking the tremble she tried to hide. And in that same moment, Everett's eyes flicked toward the tip jar, toward the place where gratitude was supposed to live. It wasn't there. The empty space behind the bar hit him harder than Lyle's words ever could, because Everett knew exactly what that missing jar meant, and he knew it wasn't new. The room roared into the final seconds of the year, voices rising toward midnight, while Clara stepped toward the door like she was being erased. Everett stayed seated, jaw locked, hands steady only by force. And as the countdown began in earnest, one truth settled inside him with a cold certainty. If he didn't act, the new year would begin with the same old cruelty. Only now, it would be his cruelty too. Clara stepped out into the cold like someone leaving a bright room for a darker truth, and the night air hit her face with a blunt honesty. Behind her, the bar kept shining, spilling music and laughter onto the sidewalk as if nothing had happened. The countdown swelled inside, muffled by the glass, and for a moment it sounded like the whole world was celebrating without her. She held her apron in one hand, folded tight, as if it could keep her together. Her breath rose in pale clouds, and each one felt like a question she didn't have the strength to ask aloud. She walked a few steps, then stopped at the curb under a street lamp that flickered like it was tired too. The gold confetti stuck to her sleeve glittered for a second, beautiful and cruel at the same time. Clara brushed at it, but it clung stubbornly, like humiliation always did. Her eyes burned and she blinked hard, refusing to cry where anyone might see. Not because crying was weak, but because she had spent too many nights being strong for people who never noticed. Across the street, Everett followed at a distance, keeping his cap low, keeping himself small, as if he still needed the disguise to hold. He watched her shoulders rise and fall, watched her sit slowly on the curb, as though her bones had suddenly turned heavy. The fireworks began somewhere far away, sharp bursts of color behind the buildings, and the sound reached them late, like joy arriving after the door was closed. Everett felt the shame spread through him in waves, shame that he had allowed this place to become a trap, shame that he had sat still while someone else paid the price. Money had built his world high, but it had also made him silent in all the places that mattered. Clara pressed her palms together for a moment, not dramatic, not loud, just a small prayer squeezed into the space she had left. She didn't ask for revenge, and she didn't ask for riches. She asked for strength to keep her heart from hardening, because that was the part she feared losing most. The job could take her hours, her pride, even her security. But if it took her softness, she wouldn't know who she was anymore. Her lips moved silently, and the street lamp made a halo of weak light over her bowed head. Everett stood behind her, unseen, and felt something in him crack open that no boardroom victory had ever touched. He had told himself he came here to catch theft, to confirm numbers, to expose a rotten manager like a problem on a spreadsheet. But watching Clara pray in the cold, he realized the real theft had been happening in plain sight. Stolen dignity, stolen safety, stolen peace. His hand drifted toward his pocket where his phone waited, heavy as a promise. And as the last fireworks of midnight faded into smoke, Everett understood the choice he could no longer postpone. Whether he would step forward as a man with a conscience, or retreat again into comfort and call it business. Everett waited until the street felt emptier, until the noise from the bar softened into a distant throb behind the glass. He approached slowly, careful with his steps, as if the ground itself might accuse him. Clara didn't look up at first. She kept her gaze on the curb, on the grit between the cracks, on anything that didn't move. When Everett stopped a few feet away, he didn't speak like a savior, and he didn't reach for his wallet. He only pulled off his coat, worn on purpose, but still warmer than her thin uniform, and held it out with both hands. Clara's eyes lifted then, wary and tired, the way someone looks when kindness has been used against them before. "You don't have to," she murmured, and her voice carried more pride than she could afford. Everett nodded, as if he understood that refusing was how she stayed in control of at least one thing tonight. "I know," he said softly, "but you're freezing." The coat hung between them like a question, and after a long pause, Clara accepted it without gratitude that sounded like debt. She just wrapped it around her shoulders and breathed in once, as if warmth could remind her she was still real. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant fireworks and the nearer sound of cars sliding through the cold. Everett didn't ask why she needed the job, and Clara didn't ask why he had been sitting alone in a luxury bar, looking like he'd lost everything. Some conversations began better without explanations. Clara's hands trembled as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and Everett saw how hard she was working to keep her face composed. "He's done that before," she finally said, and the simplicity of it was heavier than anger. Not the firing part, the public part. Everett kept his voice calm, even though his chest felt tight. "To you?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then shook her head once. "To anyone who makes him feel small," she replied. "Or anyone who makes him look wrong." She told him about the schedules, how the good shifts went to the ones who stayed quiet, how the worst hours appeared on the calendars of anyone who complained. She told him about the tip pool, how it was supposed to be fair, but somehow the pool always came up shallow, like gratitude evaporated before it reached the people who earned it. And as she spoke, Everett felt the puzzle pieces click together with an ugly precision. He didn't interrupt. He listened the way he should have listened years ago, the way leaders always claim they do and rarely prove. Clara's voice stayed steady, but her eyes kept flicking toward the bar's front windows, as if she expected Lyle to burst out and finish the humiliation outside too. Everett followed her gaze, then lowered his eyes again, staying in character, staying ordinary. "Do you have proof?" he asked gently. Clara let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "We never have proof," she said. "We have patterns, we have fear, and we have a lot of people who can't afford to lose their jobs." Everett reached into his pocket slowly, not dramatic, not flashy, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face for a moment, revealing something in his eyes that didn't match the disguise, an edge of authority restrained by discipline. "Patterns matter," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara watched his thumb hover, then pause, as if he were deciding how far to go. She didn't ask who he was, but her expression tightened with a strange instinct, like her heart sensed there was more to him than hunger. Everett slipped the phone back into his pocket without making the call yet, and his quiet restraint felt almost painful. Then he looked at her, really looked, and spoke with a softness that carried weight. "What you did in there," he said, "wasn't wrong." Clara blinked, and for a moment the armor in her face cracked, letting something tender show through. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, as if to keep that tenderness from spilling out. "Kindness always costs something," she whispered. Everett nodded once, feeling the truth of it settle into him, and as the street lamp flickered above them, Clara understood, without being told, that this stranger wasn't just listening for comfort. He was listening for the right moment to strike. They went back toward the bar slowly, not because Clara wanted to return, but because leaving felt like letting the story end the way Lyle wanted. Everett walked half a step behind her, letting her set the pace, letting her decide what courage looked like tonight. Through the windows, the party still shimmered, faces flushed with champagne, lights blinking like borrowed joy, confetti drifting under careless shoes. Clara paused at the door, hand hovering near the handle, as if the glass might burn her. Everett didn't rush her, he simply waited, steady as a shadow that had finally chosen a direction. Inside, midnight had already happened, and the room was celebrating the new year like it could erase the old one. A chant rolled across the tables, and someone popped another bottle, the sound sharp as a starter pistol. Clara kept her head up as she stepped back in, but Everett noticed how her shoulders stiffened, bracing for impact. Lyle stood near the register, laughing too loudly, his hand resting possessively where the tip jar should have been. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, and for a split second his smile slipped, just enough to show he hadn't expected her to return at all. Everett's gaze traveled the room the way a searchlight moves, quiet but relentless. He noticed the safe room door behind the bar, slightly ajar, like someone had gone in and out too often. He watched how receipts were gathered, how certain slips were folded and pocketed instead of filed. He saw a young server get scolded for setting a glass down too slowly, and the server apologized like a child who expected punishment for breathing. This wasn't a single bad moment. It was a system trained into people's bones. And Everett felt his stomach harden with resolve, the kind that doesn't need applause. Clara moved toward the back, not to beg for her job, but to return what was hers, her apron, her dignity, her right to walk out without being chased by shame. Lyle intercepted her with a smile that looked friendly from a distance and cruel up close. "Forgot something?" he asked, voice sweet as syrup, eyes sharp as broken glass. Clara held his gaze, calm in a way that cost her everything, and said, "I'm returning what belongs to the company." The words were polite, but there was steel under them, and it made Lyle's jaw tighten. Everett felt the moment stretch, thin as wire. He slid his phone from his pocket where no one could see, his thumb moving once, deliberate and quiet. A message went out. Simple, coded, practiced, activating an audit he had prepared long before he walked in wearing rags. Tonight wasn't just instinct anymore, it was a plan coming alive. Everett slipped the phone away and lifted his eyes, meeting Lyle's gaze for the first time with something that didn't look like poverty at all. And in that glance, Lyle seemed to sense it, some shift in the air, some invisible door closing behind him. The music kept playing and people kept laughing, but the room's warmth couldn't hide the way Lyle suddenly began checking corners, glancing toward the back office, swallowing too often. Clara stood beside the bar, hands steady at her sides, trying not to hope too loudly. Everett stayed silent, letting the tension do its work, letting the new year begin with truth instead of glitter. And as the door to the bar opened again, this time with purpose, not celebration, Everett knew someone had arrived who wouldn't be fooled by smiles. The door opened with a clean, purposeful sound that didn't match the bar's sloppy celebration. Two people stepped in, well-dressed, sober-eyed, carrying clipboards and the kind of calm that didn't ask permission. They didn't move like customers hunting a table. They moved like professionals looking for the truth. Lyle's laugh hit a wrong note and died too quickly, as if his throat had suddenly gone dry. Clara felt her pulse spike because the air had changed, and everyone could sense it even if they didn't understand why. Everett stayed on his stool for a moment longer, letting the scene settle into place like a final piece of a puzzle. The auditors, his auditors, scanned the room, then the bar, then the back office door with quiet precision. One of them paused at the empty space where the tip jar should have been, eyebrows tightening just slightly. Lyle stepped forward fast, smiling too hard, hands open as if friendliness could block a hallway. "Happy New Year," he said, voice bright, trying to turn them into part of the party. But the look he got back was polite and unmoved, the look of people trained not to be charmed. Clara watched Everett's posture change in a way that was almost invisible, yet unmistakable. He didn't stand like a hungry man anymore. He stood like a man who had decided. He set his napkin down carefully, as if closing a chapter, then turned toward Clara with an expression that held apology without asking for forgiveness. "I need you to hear something," he said softly, just loud enough for her and for Lyle, who had edged closer to listen. Clara's eyes narrowed, wary, because hope had hurt her before. "What is this?" she whispered, clutching her apron to keep her hands from shaking. Everett took a slow breath and let the words come out plain, without drama, without pride. "I own this place," he said, "and something has been bleeding it for a long time." The sentence hung in the air like a bell struck once, deep and undeniable. Clara's first reaction wasn't relief. It was disbelief, sharp and automatic, because people like her didn't get rescued by strangers. Her gaze searched his face for the lie, for the punchline, for the trick. Lyle's smile twitched, then reformed into a smooth mask, but the fear behind it was suddenly obvious. Everett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key card and a ring of keys that didn't belong to a broke stranger. He didn't wave them. He simply let them be seen. Clara's breath caught, and her disbelief softened into something more dangerous. Hope mixed with fear, because hope had consequences in places like this. Lyle stepped in fast, voice silky, trying to seize control of the story. "Sir," he said, leaning forward as if they were allies, "if this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can talk privately. No need to disturb the guests." His eyes flicked toward Clara like a warning. "Don't you dare believe this." Then Lyle made his desperate move. He pivoted toward the back office with sudden urgency, reaching for the safe room door as if he'd just remembered something important. The auditor's attention snapped to him, and Everett's voice sharpened, not loud but absolute. "Stop," Everett said. Lyle hesitated for half a heartbeat, and in that half heartbeat, Clara saw it clearly. A man cornered, calculating what he could destroy before truth arrived. Because whatever was behind that door wasn't just paperwork, it was years of stolen dignity, stacked neatly like receipts. And Lyle was about to try to erase it all. Lyle's hand was already on the safe room door when Everett's single word stopped him cold. The music in the bar kept playing, but the space around the counter felt suddenly quieter, like the whole room had leaned closer without realizing it. Clara stood rigid beside the bar, her apron clutched at her waist, watching Lyle's smile try to survive on a face that was beginning to crack. The auditors didn't rush, didn't raise their voices, didn't offer threats. They simply positioned themselves where they could see everything, and that calm made Lyle's panic louder than any accusation. Lyle recovered fast, turning back with the polished expression of a man who believed charm could rewrite reality. "Mr. Hale," he said smoothly, using the name like a handshake, "I was just going to grab the end-of-night paperwork. You know, standard procedure." His eyes flicked to the auditors, then to Clara, then back to Everett, measuring which lie would land best. "If there's been bleeding, it's because staff have been careless," he added, voice firming, "and I've been the one holding this place together." Clara felt heat rise behind her eyes, because the audacity of it was almost worse than the humiliation, like he was stealing the truth while she stood there watching. Everett didn't argue. He asked questions, calm as a judge and sharper than a blade. "Show me the tip pool logs," he said. Lyle laughed lightly, a sound meant to soften tension, but it came out strained. "We can pull those later," he replied. "It's New Year's. Let's not make this a spectacle." Everett's gaze didn't move. "It became a spectacle when you fired her for feeding a hungry man," he said, and the words were quiet enough to be deadly. Clara's throat tightened, because hearing someone name the injustice out loud felt like fresh air after years of swallowing smoke. Lyle tried a new angle, stepping closer as if he could physically press Everett back into silence. "She stole," he insisted, pointing at Clara's apron like it was evidence. "She altered a receipt. She gave away food. If we allow that, we encourage theft. I'm protecting your business." Clara opened her mouth, but her voice caught on old fear. She could already see the pattern. If she defended herself too passionately, she'd be labeled unstable. If she stayed quiet, she'd be labeled guilty. Everett looked at her once, and that single glance told her he had seen the trap. One of the auditors stepped forward and asked, "Where is the tip jar?" The question was simple, but it cut the room like glass. Lyle's eyes darted again, and for a second he didn't answer, as if his brain had to choose between lies. "We moved it," he said finally, "for security." The auditor's pen paused, then wrote anyway, and the sound of that pen on paper felt louder than the music. Everett nodded once, as if accepting the lie only so it could be measured against the truth. "Open the safe room," Everett said. Lyle's smile tightened, and Clara saw the desperation behind it bloom. "That's not necessary," he protested, voice sharpening. "The safe room is restricted. It's for management, for—" He searched for the right word, the right excuse, the right authority to borrow. Everett stepped closer, not angry, just unmovable. "I am the authority," he said, and the sentence landed with a weight that made Lyle's shoulders stiffen. For the first time, Clara saw Lyle's power shrink, not because someone yelled louder, but because someone finally stood where he could no longer push. With a trembling hand he tried to hide, Lyle reached for the keys, fumbling as if metal had turned slippery in his grip. The auditors watched without blinking, and Everett watched like a man watching a confession form on someone else's face. The safe room door opened, and the bright office light spilled out onto the bar floor, washing the glitter and confetti in a pale, unforgiving glow. Inside, a ledger sat open on a desk, and stacks of receipts were arranged too neatly to be innocent. Clara's heart hammered because she could feel it. Years of quiet suffering were about to become visible. And as Lyle stepped aside with a forced laugh that sounded like it might break, Everett leaned in and saw the first page of numbers that didn't match the story he'd been told. Everett's eyes moved over the ledger the way a surgeon studies a scan, quiet, exact, and increasingly grim. The numbers didn't scream at first, they whispered. Tips logged in rounded amounts that didn't match the nightly receipts. Payouts marked as pool distribution, with signatures that looked copied, rushed, or forced. Shifts swapped on paper after the fact, as if time itself could be edited to punish the wrong people. Clara stood at the doorway, staring at the pages like they were proof that her instincts had been right all along. Lyle tried to talk over the evidence, his voice climbing into excuses the way a drowning man climbs onto anything that floats. "That's normal," he said quickly. "Accounting quirks, end-of-year adjustments. You know how it gets." He laughed once, too sharp, and pointed at a column, as if pointing could change what it meant. "I've been managing chaos," he insisted. "If I didn't keep things tight, the staff would walk all over you." The auditors didn't respond. They only kept turning pages, page after page, letting truth accumulate like weight. Then one auditor laid out the receipts in a clean line across the desk, matching timestamps to the ledger entries. It was simple work, but it felt like watching a curtain pulled back. A tip left at 10:14 showed up as cash variance at 10:30. A pooled amount that should have been shared showed up as management reconciliation. Again and again the trail pointed in one direction, out of the staff's hands and into a private pocket. Clara's throat tightened as she realized it wasn't random loss or bad luck. It was systematic, rehearsed, and practiced with confidence. Everett closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to contain what surged inside him. He thought of the nights he had sat in clean offices, signing documents, trusting summaries, convincing himself that distance was efficiency. He thought of the employees who had smiled for customers while swallowing humiliation, and he felt the shame of knowing his silence had helped Lyle become bold. When he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation left in them, only clarity. "This ends tonight," he said, not like a threat, but like a decision. Lyle's face shifted, cycling through charm, anger, and finally something raw. "You can't prove intent," he snapped, voice cracking at the edges. "People make mistakes. They miscount. He stopped when Everett raised a hand, because Everett wasn't arguing anymore. He was finished being persuaded by noise. "You didn't just take money," Everett said quietly. "You took dignity. You taught fear. You made cruelty into policy." The words landed like stones, and for the first time Lyle had no clever sentence ready to catch them. Clara felt herself tremble, not from fear now, but from the sudden release of it. The auditors stepped aside, and Everett turned toward her with an expression that held regret without trying to purchase forgiveness. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and the simplicity mattered because it didn't demand she comfort him. Then he looked at the auditors again and gave instructions that sounded like order restored: termination, investigation, restitution, and immediate transparency. Lyle's shoulders slumped, as if the room had finally become too bright to hide in. Everett walked back out to the bar and asked the staff to gather, not for spectacle, but for honesty. People approached slowly, cautious like animals who had been trained not to trust open hands. Clara stood near the front, still in her red uniform, feeling everyone's eyes and realizing she was no longer the example of punishment. She was the proof that kindness had not been pointless. Everett placed a sealed envelope on the counter, thick with recovered cash, and the staff stared as if money could be both relief and grief at once. "This belongs to you," he said, voice steady, "and it will be returned properly. Every dollar accounted for." Then he turned to Clara, and his tone softened without losing strength. "You're reinstated," he said, "with a raise, and with protection that should have existed long before tonight." Clara's breath caught, because it felt like hearing the world speak back after years of shouting into silence. But even as the room exhaled, she saw the deeper question still hanging in the air. Quiet, heavy, and unresolved. Because money could be returned and jobs could be restored, but trust was a different kind of debt, and it didn't disappear just because the ledger finally told the truth. In the days that followed, the bar looked the same from the street. Still warm lights, still polished windows, still a sign that promised comfort. But inside, something had shifted that no decoration could fake. The staff moved a little slower, not from laziness, but from the unfamiliar feeling of not being hunted. Conversations happened in normal voices instead of whispers. People smiled without scanning the room for consequences. And Clara kept expecting the old fear to rush back in, the way the body expects pain even after the blow has stopped. Everett returned early one morning before the doors opened, when the bar smelled like fresh cleaner instead of champagne. He didn't arrive with a speech prepared or a photographer behind him. He arrived with a notebook, a quiet posture, and the kind of seriousness that didn't need to be loud. He asked the staff to sit, everyone from servers to dishwashers, and he listened while the coffee cooled. One by one, they spoke about the little humiliations that had piled up into something unbearable. Shifts cut as punishment, tips lost, mistakes exaggerated into shame. Everett wrote it all down, not to build a case, there was already a case, but to build a memory that would keep him honest. Clara spoke last, her hands folded tightly to keep them steady. She admitted something she didn't like admitting, that she had started to feel her kindness thinning out. Not because she wanted to be cruel, but because constant fear turned softness into exhaustion. Some nights she had caught herself looking at struggling customers with irritation instead of empathy, and that scared her more than Lyle ever had. "I don't want this place to make me hard," she said, voice low, eyes wet but steady. The room went quiet, not with discomfort but with recognition, because they all knew what it cost to stay gentle in a harsh system. Everett didn't promise perfection. He promised structure, transparency, and consequences, real ones. The tip system was rebuilt from the ground up. Clear nightly records, staff access to totals, independent oversight, and no single person holding the keys to everyone's gratitude. Scheduling became documented and fair, with checks that prevented retaliation. An anonymous reporting line was created, and Everett made it clear that silence would no longer be rewarded. But he also admitted something harder. Policies could stop theft, yet they couldn't automatically restore trust. Trust needed faces, presence, and time. On the last page of his notebook, Everett wrote one sentence and then looked directly at Clara. "I need someone here who leads with a conscience," he said, and the room held its breath, as if it recognized the weight of what was coming. He offered her a new position, one with authority over schedules and tip transparency, with training, support, and the power to protect the staff the way she had tried to protect a stranger. Clara's heart raced, because the offer felt like a door opening onto a life she hadn't dared to imagine. But her eyes dropped to her hands, and she hesitated, not from lack of courage, but from the fear of believing in something good too quickly. Weeks later, the bar still looked the same from the street. Warm lights, polished glass, a sign that promised comfort. But inside, the atmosphere had changed in a way no decoration could fake. The staff moved with less tension in their shoulders, and the laughter sounded less like performance and more like relief. People spoke in normal tones, not whispers shaped by fear. Everett began showing up often, not as a distant owner, but as a man trying to earn back what negligence had cost. And Clara could feel it in the smallest details. Problems were handled with fairness, not humiliation. Clara accepted the new role after several sleepless nights, not because she wanted power, but because she understood what the lack of it had done to everyone. She asked for training, for written systems, for transparency that couldn't be forgotten when it became inconvenient. The new schedule board was built around clear rules, and those rules were posted where everyone could read them without asking permission. Tip reporting became a nightly ritual, numbers logged, totals verified, staff able to see the full picture with their own eyes. For the first time in years, the math matched the effort, and that simple alignment felt like justice made practical. Everett didn't try to turn the change into a grand story about himself. He offered restitution carefully, openly, with accountability, and he let the staff react however they needed to react. Some cried the first time their full tips appeared, quiet tears that carried years of swallowed frustration. Others didn't celebrate at all. They simply exhaled, like their bodies had been holding their breath for too long. Everett listened more than he spoke, learning names again, learning schedules, learning the difference between being respected and being trusted. He understood that trust couldn't be demanded the way profits could. Trust had to be earned in ordinary moments, over and over. One evening, a man came in with tired eyes and clothes that looked too thin for the season. The room grew still in that old familiar way, as if everyone remembered what it felt like to see someone vulnerable in the wrong place. Clara noticed, and she felt a flicker of the past, the sting, the fear, the temptation to look away before trouble found her. But she walked over anyway, calm and steady, and she poured water first, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Then she set down food without making him plead for it, her voice gentle, her posture unshaken. Everett watched from a distance, and in that moment he understood the true answer she'd given him on New Year's Eve. Dignity offered without conditions, even when it came with a cost. As the year continued, the bar became what it was supposed to be, a place where people didn't have to prove their worth to be treated decently. Clara didn't become perfect, and Everett didn't become flawless, but both of them chose the harder path, staying human. The new systems protected workers, but it was the daily tone, respect in small decisions, that made the protection real. Everett's legacy stopped being a name on paper and started becoming a responsibility he carried with his presence. And Clara's kindness, once punished, became a standard that quietly reshaped the room. In that kind of change, the new year didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like peace. Happy New Year to you and everyone you love. May this next year meet you with health, calm, and people who treat you with dignity. Where are you spending New Year's Eve? At home, with family, with friends, or somewhere meaningful? If you feel like sharing, I'd love to read it in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, leave a heart and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.